Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Manga Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. The house was silent, the kind of silence that seemed to press against the walls, amplifying every creak and groan. Michael stared at the dining table, a space where years of family meals and shared laughter had once been the norm. The candles from their 22nd wedding anniversary still sat there, their wicks blackened, a faint reminder of a celebration that now felt hollow. The irony of their pristine suburban home, immaculate yet cold, wasn't lost on him. Beneath its well-maintained exterior, secrets festered. Michael had always considered himself a patient man. Over the years, he had quietly endured Vanessa's complaints about his long hours, her yearning for the excitement that seemed to elude their predictable life. He had brushed off the subtle changes, the late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room, her newfound interest in social outings she never invited him to join. Loyalty was the foundation of their marriage, he'd believed. Shirley was unshakable, but then came the moment he could no longer ignore. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when Michael found the receipt. Vanessa had been out that day, claiming she needed some time to herself. He didn't question it. After all, she often needed these breaks from the humdrum of suburban life. But as he emptied the trash in the kitchen, the receipt caught his eye. A charge for an upscale restaurant he'd never heard of. It wasn't Vanessa dining alone. There were 2 meals listed, along with a bottle of wine far too expensive for a casual outing. Something inside him shifted. That was when the questions he had pushed away began to resurface. The missed calls from unknown numbers, the way her phone screen always seemed to face down, and the quick excuses that brushed off her absences. Michael wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but his instincts that had guided him through countless corporate negotiations were screaming for attention. That night, as Vanessa sat across from him, her smile as radiant as ever, Michael felt the first pangs of doubt morph into a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. He didn't confront her, not yet. He had spent decades analyzing problems, dismantling them piece by piece until solutions revealed themselves. This would be no different. The following week, Michael began his quiet investigation. He started with small steps, careful not to tip his hand. He cross-checked their financial records, looking for anomalies. A pattern emerged. Charges for boutique hotels, exclusive spas, and restaurants well outside their usual haunts. Then there was her gym membership, a new addition in recent months, complete with a personal trainer named Paul. The name began to haunt him. Michael drove to the gym one evening, parking discreetly across the street. Through the wide glass windows, he watched Vanessa laughing at something Paul said. The sight struck him like a physical blow. This was not the Vanessa he knew, the one who used to find joy in their children's accomplishments, who used to share quiet evenings with him on the porch. This woman was vibrant, carefree, and so far removed from the life they had built together. Yet, it was not until he overheard a fragment of a conversation on her phone that the reality fully sank in. Vanessa had been in the kitchen, her voice hushed but unmistakably giddy. "Next weekend works for me," she'd said. "He's too busy with work to notice. I'll meet you at the lodge." Michael's grip tightened around the doorknob as he listened, the words confirming what his heart had dreaded. She was planning a weekend away with Paul. The betrayal wasn't just in her actions, it was in the ease with which she carried them out, as though his trust were an inconvenience she could sidestep. It wasn't rage that consumed Michael in that moment, but a cold, calculated fury. She thought he was too blind to see, too trusting to suspect. She had underestimated him. For the rest of the week, Michael played his role perfectly. He kissed Vanessa goodnight, discussed trivialities about their neighbors, and even brought her coffee in the mornings. But beneath his composed demeanor, he was strategizing, planning his next move. When Vanessa packed her bag that Friday evening, Michael didn't stop her. He watched as she kissed him on the cheek, her voice laced with manufactured affection. "Don't work too hard this weekend," she said. As her car disappeared down the driveway, Michael turned to his laptop, opening the surveillance footage he'd commissioned 2 days earlier. Hidden cameras in the lodge would provide all the evidence he needed. It was no longer about confronting her in anger. It was about reclaiming the dignity she had stripped from him. For Michael, this wasn't just about exposing Vanessa's betrayal. It was about ensuring that when the truth finally came out, she would feel the weight of every choice she had made. And so, as the quiet of the house settled around him, he began to prepare for the reckoning ahead. Second, he found that he loved her too. He had no memory of facing the pain of their separation. The anniversary dinner, now days away, would no longer be a celebration of love. It would be a reckoning. Michael would make sure of that. The lodge was picturesque, tucked away in the woods, its rustic charm catering to those seeking intimacy and seclusion. Vanessa had chosen well. Too well, Michael thought as he reviewed the footage from his living room. Her precision in covering her tracks was evident, but it hadn't been enough. The first clip played on the laptop screen, Vanessa arriving at the lodge in her SUV, the same carefree smile she used to reserve for him, lighting up her face. Minutes later, Paul's sleek convertible pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out, his confidence palpable, as he greeted her with an embrace that lingered far too long. Michael's fist clenched, but he didn't allow his emotions to take over. There was no room for outbursts now. This was a time for strategy. He watched as the two entered the lodge together, Vanessa's hand brushing Paul's arm in a way that spoke volumes. He couldn't hear their words, but their body language screamed betrayal. The surveillance team Michael had hired was discreet but thorough. Over the next few hours, he received clips documenting the couple's movements. The romantic dinner for two, the private cabin they retired to, and even a stroll by the lake under the moonlight. Each scene played out like a twisted parody of the life Vanessa and Michael had once shared. Michael sat in his office, his phone buzzing intermittently with updates from his team. Every buzz felt like a hammer to his resolve, but he forced himself to remain calm. This wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about ensuring that when the moment came, Vanessa would have no room to twist the narrative, no opportunity to deny her betrayal. It wasn't enough to see it for himself. He needed to expose her deception where it would sting the most. That thought crystallized as he planned the anniversary dinner. The family had been invited weeks ago, a rare gathering that Vanessa had insisted upon. She'd wanted to project the image of the perfect wife, the gracious hostess. The irony was almost laughable. By Saturday morning, Michael had shifted his focus to their children. Claire, their 19-year-old daughter, was home from college for the weekend. She had always idolized her mother, seeing Vanessa as the glue that held the family together. Michael knew the truth would devastate her, but he also knew that shielding Claire from the reality would only prolong the pain. "Still looking for the proof," he said. "You have to be crazy." He found Claire in the backyard, lounging with a novel in hand. The sun bathed her in a soft glow, and for a moment Michael hesitated. How could he shatter the world of someone so innocent? But then he remembered the lies, the deceit that Vanessa had woven so seamlessly into their lives. He sat down beside Claire, the weight of the conversation pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Dad?" Claire asked, looking up from her book. "You okay?" Michael nodded, though his expression betrayed him. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "It's about your mom." Claire's brow furrowed as she set her book aside. "What about her?" Michael took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "She's been seeing someone else." a man named Paul. I think it's time for us to break up." She wrapped her arms around his waist. The color drained from Claire's face. "What are you saying? Mom wouldn't—" Her voice cracked, and she fell silent. "I didn't want to believe it either," Michael said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But I have proof. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I wish I didn't have to tell you this." Claire's eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment she was silent. Then anger replaced her shock. "She's been lying to us? To you?" Michael nodded, his heart breaking at the pain in her voice. "Yes, but I promise you, Claire, I'm going to handle this. I just need you to be strong." "I can handle anything," he told her. "Go on. I think I really need it right now." Claire straightened, her jaw set. She doesn't deserve to get away with this. Michael couldn't help but feel a swell of pride at her determination, though it was bittersweet. He had hoped to shield his daughter from the ugliness of the situation, but she was proving to be stronger than he'd anticipated. As Saturday turned to Sunday, Michael finalized his plans for the anniversary dinner. He contacted the restaurant Vanessa had chosen and coordinated with the staff. By the time the event began, everything was in place. The guests arrived one by one, unaware of the storm brewing beneath Michael's composed exterior. Vanessa, radiant in a flowing dress, greeted everyone with her usual charm, her betrayal hidden behind a mask of wifely devotion. Would Michael have the upper hand now? As he sat at the head of the table, surrounded by family and friends, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. The truth would come out, and Vanessa's carefully constructed facade would crumble before their eyes. This dinner wouldn't be the celebration she had envisioned. It would be her reckoning, and Michael would ensure that when the night was over, there would be no going back. The anniversary dinner was a spectacle of appearances. The restaurant, a luxurious venue Vanessa had selected weeks ago, was a blend of sophistication and intimacy. Candlelight flickered on polished tabletops, casting warm glows over the faces of their closest family and friends. Vanessa's laughter rang out often, effortless and genuine, her confidence buoyed by the belief that Michael remained oblivious. Michael, however, had rehearsed his role well. His expressions were measured, his tone calm, his every word betraying none of the storm inside him. He observed her as she moved through the room with practiced grace, greeting guests and charming even the most reticent of attendees. To anyone watching, she was the epitome of elegance, a devoted wife, a loving mother, and the perfect hostess. But Michael knew better. Every glance she shared with Claire, every laugh she offered his brother-in-law, felt like a mockery. Yet he stayed silent, biding his time. Michael's plan had been meticulous. Earlier in the day, he'd spoken to the restaurant manager, a middle-aged man with a sharp attention to detail. Michael had arranged for a discreet technical setup. A screen and projector would be ready to display the evidence he'd collected. It would happen after the toast, a moment Vanessa had planned as the pinnacle of the evening. As the guests settled into their seats, Michael allowed himself a moment of reflection. This dinner wasn't just about exposing Vanessa. It was about dismantling the illusion she had so carefully curated. For 22 years they had built a life together, or so he thought. Tonight, the scaffolding of deceit would fall, revealing the truth to everyone she held dear. The courses began to arrive, starting with appetizers of seared scallops and seasonal greens. Vanessa played her role perfectly, leaning into Michael as she recounted fond memories of their marriage to the table. "Michael has always been my rock," she said, her hand brushing his arm. "I couldn't have asked for a better partner." Michael felt Claire's gaze on him from across the table. She hadn't spoken much since she arrived, her demeanor unusually reserved. The knowledge she now carried weighed on her, and Michael hated that his daughter had to endure this, but he had been clear. She needed to let him handle it. He had no choice but to help her with her sleep. Feeling she needed to sleep, she crawled under the blankets and settled in. Vanessa's voice broke into his thoughts. "Michael, darling, aren't you going to say a few words? It is our anniversary, after all." The room quieted as all eyes turned to him. Michael smiled, lifting his glass. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. "It's not every day you get to celebrate 22 years with someone who has been such a profound influence on your life." Laura got up and stood beside Michael. Although she was careful, Vanessa beamed, her confidence radiating across the table. "Oh, Michael," she said softly, dabbing the corner of her eye with a napkin. Michael's grip on the glass tightened slightly. "This journey hasn't been without its challenges, of course," he continued. "But tonight, I want to focus on gratitude. Gratitude for family, for the love we share, and for the honesty that binds us all together." A flicker of unease crossed Vanessa's face, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Beautifully said," she murmured, clinking her glass to his. Michael sipped his wine, setting the glass down with deliberate care. "And with that," he said, "I have something special I'd like to share." Vanessa's brows furrowed slightly as Michael rose from his seat. He walked to the side of the room, signaling to the manager, who nodded and dimmed the lights. A hush fell over the guests as the projector screen descended. "I wanted to take a moment to celebrate the memories we've made," Michael said, his voice calm but laced with something Vanessa couldn't quite place. "But also to honor the truth. Yes, that was mighty cool. Looking forward to doing this again. Now, if you'll excuse me." The first image appeared on the screen. A photograph of Vanessa and Paul at the lodge, their hands entwined as they strolled by the lake. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of confusion. Vanessa froze, her glass halfway to her lips. "Yeah, what is this?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael ignored her, clicking to the next slide. A series of timestamps documenting their romantic dinner, their cabin entry, and the subsequent hours they spent together. "These," he said, turning to face the stunned guests, "are the moments my wife spent away from me, with someone else." Vanessa's face drained of color. "Michael," she began. But he held up a hand. "Not now, Vanessa," he said coldly. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone here who believed in the life we built together. Our children, our friends, they deserve to know the truth." "Why do you think the truth about us is so deadly?" Claire's expression was a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Her hand trembled as she pushed her chair back and stood. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Mom, how could you do this to Dad? To us?" Vanessa's composure crumbled. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said, her voice desperate. "Michael, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," Michael cut in. "You've already said enough with your actions." Paul, who had been sitting uncomfortably close to Vanessa's sister, shifted uneasily in his seat. The room was thick with tension, every guest caught between shock and disbelief. Michael turned back to the screen, revealing the final slide, a still image of Vanessa and Paul kissing passionately. "This," he said, his voice firm, "is who she chose to be. But I choose dignity, and I choose to walk away." Then the text came up. Kathleen Getting's Chronicles. It was from the comical. Vanessa buried her face in her hands, sobbing as the room descended into chaos. Michael stood tall, his shoulders square, as he walked away from the table, leaving behind a marriage that had once defined his life. "My ancestors, dare we view our greatest treasure, a last taste of hope." He was done pretending. Tonight was the beginning of something new. The aftermath of Michael's revelation at the dinner was a whirlwind of emotions, accusations, and shattered facades. As he walked out of the restaurant that night, the murmurs of disbelief and outrage from their family and friends echoed faintly behind him. He felt no satisfaction in his actions, only a cold, numbing sense of finality. The weight of 22 years of marriage now felt distant, like a book he had placed on a high shelf, knowing he would never open it again. The next morning, Michael awoke early, his body restless despite the emotional exhaustion. Sunlight spilled through the curtains, illuminating the guest bedroom where he had slept. He couldn't bear to lie in the bed he had shared with Vanessa, not after the truth had been laid bare. The house was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that carried with it the specter of unresolved tension. Claire was the first to emerge. She had stayed up late, processing what had unfolded. Her footsteps were tentative as she walked into the kitchen, where Michael was nursing a cup of coffee. She sat down across from him, her eyes still red from crying. "Mrs. Roden." "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "I had no idea." "How long have you known?" Michael exhaled, setting down his mug. "A few weeks, maybe longer if I'm honest with myself. There were signs I ignored for too long." Claire's expression darkened. "She humiliated you. She lied to us. How could she do that to her own family?" Michael reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. "I don't have all the answers, sweetheart. I've been asking myself the same thing. But the person she's become? It's not the woman I married." The two sat in silence for a moment before Claire spoke again, her voice edged with anger. "She's ruined everything." Michael shook his head gently. "No. She ruined her own place in this family. But you and we'll find a way to move forward together." Wiped her eyes and stared at her husband, who lay with his head against the back of the couch. Vanessa didn't come downstairs until mid-morning. Her footsteps were hesitant, almost reluctant, as if she were bracing herself for judgment. When she appeared in the kitchen doorway, she looked disheveled, her hair hastily tied back, and her face puffy from a night of crying. She hesitated, her eyes darting between Michael and Claire. "Michael," she began, her voice cracking. "We need to talk," Anthony said. He stared at her for a long moment before responding. "There's nothing left to say." Vanessa flinched at his words but pressed on. "Please, I made a mistake. I was selfish, and I lost sight of what really mattered. I was caught up in something I thought I needed, but I see now how wrong I was." Claire let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't just make a mistake, Mom. You had an affair. You lied to Dad. To me. For how long? Weeks, months, years?" The woman's contorted lips parted in a grimace. Mom laughed. "And what?" Vanessa's gaze dropped to the floor. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she murmured. "I didn't mean for it to go so far." Michael's voice was sharp, "But it did. And now you want what? Forgiveness? To go back to the way things were?" "I just want a chance to fix this," Vanessa said desperately. "I love you, Michael. I love our family. Can't we try to move past this?" Michael stood, his chair scraping against the tile as he pushed it back. "Vanessa, you didn't just break my trust. You obliterated it. You made a choice, again and again, to betray me, to betray Claire. You didn't think about fixing anything when you were sneaking off with Paul, did you?" Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but Claire interjected. "Dad's right. You didn't care about us then. Why should we believe you care now?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa looked like she wanted to argue, but there was no defense strong enough to withstand the weight of her actions. Michael turned to Claire. "Go pack a bag. We're leaving for a few days." Claire blinked, surprised. "Where are we going?" "Your Aunt Meredith's," Michael replied. "We need space, and I think you need to be around someone who can help you process this." Claire nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. She left the kitchen without another glance at her mother. Vanessa's voice trembled as she spoke. "You're just going to leave?" Michael faced her, his expression resolute. "I'm not leaving. I'm stepping away to think. But don't mistake this for anything other than what it is. The beginning of the end. Tears streamed down Vanessa's face. I love you, Michael. I always have. He shook his head. You loved the life we built, but you didn't love me enough to protect it. And that's something I can't forgive. Hours later, Michael and Claire loaded the car with a few essentials. As they drove toward Meredith's home, Claire broke the silence. Do you think she'll ever really understand what she's done? Michael glanced at his daughter, his expression unreadable. Maybe one day, but by then it won't matter. We'll have moved on. And since you say something different... Harry joined in. The quiet hum of the road filled the space between them. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a small sense of relief. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He had reclaimed his dignity, and now it was time to rebuild his life, on his terms. The morning air at Meredith's home was crisp and refreshing, carrying with it a sense of renewal. Michael sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the sprawling yard. Claire was still asleep in the guest room, her exhaustion from the emotional upheaval evident. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a fragile but unmistakable sense of peace. The decision to leave had been the right one. In this space, far from the memories of his marriage, he could think clearly about what his next steps would be. Divorce was inevitable. There was no salvaging what Vanessa had so thoroughly destroyed. But Michael wasn't driven by anger anymore. He was focused on what lay ahead. Later that morning, Meredith joined him on the porch, her usual no-nonsense demeanor softened by sympathy. You've been through hell, Michael, she said, handing him a plate of toast and eggs. But you're handling it better than most would. Michael gave her a small, tired smile. I'm not sure how much of that is strength and how much is just sheer exhaustion, he admitted. It feels like I've been running on fumes these last few weeks. Meredith nodded. It's going to take time. You've got to grieve, not just for the marriage, but for the life you thought you had. Her words settled over him like a weight. But they carried a truth he couldn't ignore. He wasn't just mourning the betrayal. He was mourning the future he'd envisioned. The one where he and Vanessa would grow old together, watching their children thrive. That future was gone, but another one was waiting to be built. As the day wore on, Michael began taking small steps toward reclaiming control of his life. He scheduled a meeting with a divorce attorney, one who came highly recommended by Meredith. He also reached out to his financial advisor, determined to ensure Vanessa's betrayal wouldn't jeopardize Claire's college fund or the retirement savings he had worked so hard to build. Like an oldie-button bell preparing for the last ring. Meanwhile, Claire was beginning her own process of healing. She spent the afternoon journaling in the backyard, occasionally seeking Michael's advice about how to handle her feelings of betrayal. I'm so angry at her, she said at one point, her voice shaking. But part of me feels guilty for being angry. She's still my mom. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It's okay to feel both, Claire. Anger and love aren't mutually exclusive. She's your mother, and that connection doesn't just disappear. But you don't have to excuse what she did either. You're allowed to hold her accountable. Claire nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's just, I thought she was better than this. Gratefully settled. So did I, Michael said quietly. But now we know the truth, and we'll deal with it together. By the time evening rolled around, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. He and Claire prepared dinner together, laughing as they debated the proper way to dice an onion. The moment was small, almost ordinary, but it reminded Michael that there was still joy to be found, even in the midst of pain. That night, after Claire had gone to bed, Michael received a message from Vanessa. It was a long text, filled with apologies and pleas for another chance. She swore she would do whatever it took to earn his forgiveness, to prove that she could change. Michael stared at the screen for a long time, the words blurring together. For a brief moment, he considered responding, if only to tell her how deeply she had hurt him. But he realized that any response would only prolong the inevitable. He deleted the message and blocked her number. The next day, Michael took Claire for a drive to a nearby park. They walked along the trails, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot. Claire seemed lighter, more at ease, and Michael realized he was starting to feel the same way. In the car, they talked about their days. Everything was seeming possible, Claire catching his eye. As they reached a clearing overlooking a serene lake, Claire turned to him. "Do you think we'll be okay, Dad?" Michael looked out at the water, the sunlight dancing on its surface. "I know we will," he said firmly. "It won't be easy, but we'll get through this, and we'll be stronger for it." He heard footsteps coming up the stairs. He pressed his lips together to climb the steps at least 10. The conversation stayed with him as they returned to Meredith's house. That evening, he sat down with a notebook and began outlining his goals for the future. He wanted to rebuild his career, focus on his health, and nurture his relationship with Claire. But more than anything, he wanted to reclaim his sense of self. The man he had been before Vanessa's betrayal had shaken him to his core. In the weeks that followed, Michael and Claire returned home, ready to face the next chapter of their lives. The house felt different, emptier, but also filled with possibilities. Michael began redecorating, making the space his own. He even started painting again, a hobby he had abandoned years ago. As he stood in his newly renovated living room one evening, a brush in hand and a canvas before him, Michael realized that the pain of betrayal was no longer the defining force in his life. It would always be part of his story, but it wouldn't be the end of it. The future was his to create, and for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to embrace it.